The year is 1603. Queen Elizabeth is gone, and James Stuart has taken her throne. James loved and adored the idea of kingship. He wrote a book about how kings are above all others and everyone should bow to him. He called himself the father of the English nation, but he did rule over Scotland as well, and together over both kingdoms he ruled by divine right. To him, Parliament was a nuisance, men who were meant to bow before him and who had grown too proud of their ancient liberties. Parliament, of course, thought otherwise. They saw themselves as the protectors of English law, the protectors of the English people, and the dam that held back the tyranny of the crown. Every time James tried to brush them aside, their resentment grew. Now, on the surface, the kingdom went about its business, as it did every day. But every session of Parliament left behind more distrust than before, like dust gathering in the corners of a house that hasn't been cleaned for quite some time. Kings, above all else, need money, and James never quite had enough. He spent what little he had freely on masks and jewels and his favorites at court, the most famous of which would be assassinated, Lord Buckingham. The treasury beneath him strained, and so new ways of squeezing the kingdom and its people from their money appeared. Monopolies were sold, and he granted courtiers the right to control the price of salt, coal, and even small things like playing cards. In exchange, they gave him more money, of which he would also spend freely. Ordinary people in England paid much more for the things of daily life as day and day passed, and they knew exactly who to blame. It wasn't just an irritation. It was a feeling that the crown had its hand in every one of their pockets. Each tax was another groan. Each tax was another sign that the structure in place could not hold forever. If money was the thing shaking the kingdom, religion was the thing that lit the fuse within. The Church of England stood tall, with bishops and altars and rituals. To many Puritans, it looked far too close to Catholicism, which they had cast off over 100 years before during the reign of Henry VIII. The Puritans wanted plain worship and strict godliness. Over time, neighbors began to judge other neighbors more harshly. If you kneeled in the wrong way or skipped one of the rituals of the English church, suspicion might follow you home. And when ministers preached about obedience to the kings, the Puritans preached back. Obedience to God comes first before obedience to kings. At the time, religion was not just a belief. It was a battle with a line drawn in the sand, and it was slowly being drawn across the land in the direction of civil war. When James finally died in 1625, his son Charles inherited the crown. This crown was meant for his older brother, who had died while James was still alive. And so the crown passed to Charles, who was never meant to be king. Charles was very different from his father. Where James argued and postured and ruffled his feathers, Charles was cold and silent and kept to himself most of the time. Yet, he believed, like his father, that he was chosen by God to rule as king, and he would not bend to Parliament. He married the Catholic Henrietta Maria, and immediately fears stirred that he was turning to Catholicism, and he might even have his children raised in the Catholic faith, who would then become Catholic kings. To many, it looked like Rome was creeping back through the door into England. Charles tried ruling with Parliament, but the quarrels grew bitter, and more bitter, and more bitter. So he shut the doors, dissolved them, and for 11 long years he ruled without them. This was called his personal rule, but his critics called it tyranny. For more than a decade, the kingdom seemed quiet from the outside, but beneath the silence, the pressure built. Without Parliament, Charles had to find new, inventive ways to get money for his government. Parliament was the only legal way you could normally get this money. So he revived an old law about ship money. Usually, coastal towns in the past had paid this tax, ship money, to build ships for the defense. Naturally, they were the most likely to be attacked since they lived on the coast and they needed those ships. But now Charles was demanding it from everyone, even farmers far inland who had never even seen the sea. And he was demanding it during peacetime. Now, people were angry about the money and the taxes, but it was also the idea that the king was reaching into every corner of England without their consent that angered them the most. One man, John Hampden, refused to pay. He found himself in court fighting over that right to not pay. He lost his case, but his defiance spread like a wildfire throughout all of the hills and the lands and the houses and the towns in England. If the king could demand this today, what might he demand tomorrow? Charles found a right-hand man in Archbishop William Laud. Laud believed that the church needed order, beauty, and ritual. He pushed for bowing at the altars, for decorated churches, and for obedience to the church, and to the king, who sat at the head of the church. To the Puritans, it was proof of Catholic corruption creeping back into everyday lives. Some who resisted Laud's rules were punished with brutality. They were branded, imprisoned, and in some cases mutilated. Their scars became warnings of what happened when you crossed the church and defied the king. Laud thought he was saving their souls, but instead he filled England with fear and fury. Then came the trouble with Scotland. Charles tried to force the Scots to use his prayer book with his version of how they should worship. And in 1637, at St. Giles Cathedral, a woman hurled her chair at the head of one of the ministers who had been sent by Charles to preach to them. Riots soon broke out and spread across the Scottish countryside. The Scots gathered together, and they all signed an agreement that they would defend their religion against the Church of England and therefore against the King of England. Charles tried to crush them with force, but his army was weak, his treasury was drained, and so he was defeated. This defeat forced him to do what he hated the most: call Parliament back in 1640. After 11 years of silence, the voices of opposition returned louder than ever, and this time they were not going to go away. When Parliament was finally recalled, it was like unlocking a room that had been sealed tight for a very long time. The air rushed over them, still tense with grievances that had been stored inside for 11 years. Members of Parliament didn't simply discuss taxes. They now unleashed all of these years of anger about ship money, monopolies being sold, favorites at court who had power that they shouldn't have, religious persecution, and, above all, the king's arrogance that he didn't need Parliament. At first, this was called the Short Parliament, because Charles closed it after only 3 weeks. But his problems with Scotland grew worse, and he was forced to summon them together again. This time Parliament stayed in place, and this was known as the Long Parliament. And once it opened, it never truly closed until war consumed the kingdom. The Long Parliament wasted no time. Laud, the Archbishop, was soon arrested, and so was Thomas Wentworth, who was the Earl of Strafford, one of Charles's most feared advisors. Strafford had ruled Ireland with a heavy hand and was hated for his cruelty there. Parliament condemned Strafford to die. Charles hesitated to sign the warrant. It was one of his closest friends and dearest allies. But, in the end, he had to let Strafford go to the scaffold. The message in this was clear. Even the king's closest allies were not safe. It was as if the walls of England were turning inward. The very servants of the crown were being dragged down into death. By 1641, distrust filled every corner of England. Parliament issued what was called the Grand Remonstrance, which was a list of all of the king's abuses over the years. This was no surprise, and it was not just a document. It was a strong indictment, and it had been thoroughly thought out. It split even Parliament itself, where some believed they were defending ancient freedoms to criticize the king and right wrongs, while others thought they were tearing down the monarchy itself. The kingdom was divided not just between king and Parliament, but within Parliament itself and within towns and families. Charles, feeling the walls closing in, tried one desperate act. In January of 1642, he marched into Parliament with armed men to arrest 5 members who had opposed him. But the men slipped away. The attempt had failed, and in that failure the king revealed just how far he was willing to go. Parliament declared the king's actions were illegal, and crowds gathered in London to jeer and mock Charles. For the first time, people spoke openly of resisting him with weapons. The House of Stuart had finally cracked. In the months that followed, both sides gathered strength. Parliament raised its militia, and Charles had fled London to gather loyal supporters for his own army. The kingdom itself seemed to split into 2. Friends, neighbors, and even families choosing sides. Royalists who had backed the king were called Cavaliers, because that was the Latin word for horse, and they used to ride their horses through the towns, showing off their strength. Parliamentarians who stood against him became known as Roundheads because of the way that they cut their hair, made their heads look particularly round. By the summer of 1642, the standoff could no longer hold. That August, Charles raised his banner at Nottingham. It was the signal that war had begun. And so, the House of Stuart, full of cracks and quarrels and restless grievances, finally collapsed in on itself. The English Civil War was no sudden occurrence. It was built year by year, tax by tax, and sermon by sermon. A kingdom that looked steady on the outside had been hollowed out from the inside all the while. Next time we'll step deeper into the story where neighbors turned on other neighbors, and the clash of king and parliament tore England apart. Until then, sleep well, and remember, history sometimes has a shadow that reminds us how fragile order can be.